Welcome to part 2 of chapter 6, where we're wrapping everything up and putting it together to then hand it off to my very capable colleagues, Coach Nunez and Coach Loomis. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about overlap. This is something I mentioned before, but essentially it boils down to expanding your horizons and how you view exercises. Bodybuilders typically have a very muscle-centric view of exercises. Squats are for quads, bench presses for chest, etc., etc. Now, this isn't completely wrong, but it does miss a few things. So let's talk about exercises in a way that's a little more useful so you can start figuring how you want to place them on different days and connecting the dots to make a cohesive program. First, let's talk about biarticular muscles. What's a biarticular muscle? It just means that it crosses two joints, which means it has two joint actions. And this sometimes can circumvent the typical way that bodybuilders think about the way muscles are trained in exercises. We'll use the squat, for example. It actually has both simultaneous knee extension and hip extension going on. That's going into an erect position at both the knee joint and hip joint, coming out of that fully sat down position at the bottom of a squat. This requires both your quadriceps to extend the knee, and also most people would think both their glutes and their hamstrings to extend the hip simultaneously. But that's not actually what happens. For example, the hamstrings, you know that they probably perform both hip extension and knee flexion. However, while you're performing knee extension on the quads, it's not very useful to have an active hamstring opposing that, because the hamstrings can't choose to only extend the hip or only flex the knee. They perform both. It's just simply a shortening action at both joints. And this is why when you look at research on squats, you typically don't see much hamstrings growth, because while you're trying to extend the knee, the biarticular muscles, the hamstrings, are not able to contract very hard and get a tension stimulus because it'd be counterproductive to the overall movement. So you typically only see glute growth from squats. Likewise, while you do see overall quadricep development, one of the heads of the quadriceps, the rectus femoris, is a biarticular muscle as well. It crosses both the hip and the knee, meaning it performs not only knee extension, but also hip flexion. And while you're trying to extend the hip, you can't be trying to flex the hip. So both the rectus femoris and the hamstrings are typically not growing in response to a squat when we look at research on this in the literature. So this is just one example of how a very basic muscle-centric view of exercises can sometimes be a little misleading. And there are other examples in other parts of the body. For example, the long head of the triceps crosses both the shoulder and the elbow. So it actually performs shoulder extension as well as elbow extension. So you typically are not going to see much long head growth when doing pressing exercises. This is one of the reasons why bodybuilders typically perform more exercises than your strength athlete or your general fitness enthusiast. Because if they want proportionate hypertrophy across their whole body, they have to fill in some of these gaps. And that's why isolation movements are sometimes useful, and why body part splits can be necessary, or why we might train multiple muscle groups on the same day and have to figure out how we play this Tetris to make sure that we get symmetrical development. Also, I want to remind you of how volume is counted in research. As I stated, it typically counts everything on a one-to-one basis, but we know in the real world that's not how things operate. A chest press is probably not going to stimulate as much triceps growth as a tricep pushdown. This goes back not only to what I just said about the long head, but also just about what's the weakest link in a given movement. When you're performing a compound lift, there's typically going to be one muscle, even when you go to failure, that might have a little juice left, while the weakest link is what's going to be preventing you from continuing to meet the force demands of the exercise. So for these reasons, we sometimes need to get outside of our typical bodybuilding thinking, which sometimes throws up roadblocks anyway. So for example, if you want to confuse a bro, ask them, is a deadlift a back exercise or is the deadlift a lower body exercise? I've seen across many years of being involved in the industry that sometimes people put deadlifts on back day or leg day. And this is a limitation of the way that bodybuilders traditionally look at exercises. So we need to step away from that. We need to start thinking about exercises differently. Another example is pullovers. So a dumbbell pullover, a relatively old school move, but it actually still has its place. You'll see some people claim it as a chest exercise, others a lat exercise. But the reality is it trains both, but most bodybuilders think you can't train the lats and the chest at the same time. But when your arm is fully over your head, in full flexion, your pec is stretched. So if it contracts, it's going to pull you towards extension. The human body is a little more complex than bodybuilders give it credit for. Yes, the pec, in some instances, is actually a shoulder extensor. So anyway, my point is not to just show off and point out some anatomy, but just to say that you do need to have a basic understanding of functional anatomy to properly program. This course won't do it on its own. But the good news is you, as a VIP Vault member, you have access to this information. You have the lifting library right there in your student dashboard, and you can take a look at that as an excellent complement to this course. So if you need to understand that functional anatomy, if you need to know which exercises to plug and play as Coach Nunez takes you through the process of building an inside-out program, I want you to check it out. The lifting library has 30-plus lifts where I've not only provided a step-by-step walkthrough, we have one of the coaches or one of the specialists showing you and demonstrating how to perform it. And in addition to that, you have a full text-based guide on how to incorporate it into a program. And this is an excellent complement to what we're doing here in this course. Other things to consider about how an exercise might impact your physique is going to be the range of motion it trains. So for example, in the real world, while we know a biceps curl is probably better than a row or a lat pull down, there's even differences between these lifts. A lat pull down actually has a whole lot more range of motion about the elbow than say a row. So when you're programming, you need to think about these considerations. How much range of motion is there about the elbow or the joint that you're thinking about? That was just an example. And also, does the exercise train the target muscles at a longer muscle length? Sometimes you'll have a movement which is compound in nature and has a lot of different muscles involved, but it's probably only going to effectively train those muscles if it takes them through a long muscle length when you're at a full range of motion. So these are the considerations you need to make when you're choosing the exercises to train different muscle groups. When you're thinking about which muscle groups are weak and strong in your physique, you want to choose useful exercises. So a basic understanding of functional anatomy, this is where the lifting library comes in, and understanding concepts like biarticular muscles. Also, long muscle lengths and range of motion about a joint are going to be critical for you to be able to choose the right exercises. An important thing is that you don't have to figure this out all on your own. You don't have to take an anatomy course. We have this pretty cool cheat sheet where we've categorized the primary and secondary muscles used in almost all bodybuilding exercises. So when you're going through and programming and figuring out which movements you want to use, you can cross-reference them with this and figure out what's the best way for me to choose the most effective exercises for my physique. In addition to that, you're going to see a text-based version of this in this chapter. So you don't have to memorize everything I said or pause or go back and keep listening to me talking over and over again. I know you're probably tired of that by this point, but you can read this. So we've got all this reference material here, additional courses to support it, and you'll be able to construct the ideal program for your individual needs. But remember, use common sense. And as you create your program, remember that it'll change over time as you may or may not progress. So if you're plateaued and everything's growing except your biceps, use common sense. Don't choose another set of rows, choose a bicep curl variation. So hopefully this all made sense. If you understand the complexity of human functional anatomy, if you understand concepts like biarticular muscles, if you understand things like synergist, if you understand range of motion and training at long muscle lengths, just from a conceptual level, and you can use this cheat sheet and also the lifting library to assist you, you're well on your way to writing a good program.